Hello class, we're going to now begin our third lesson in our chapter on biomolecules and biochemistry. Today we're going to talk about a class of molecules called carbohydrates, the polymeric form we call polysaccharides, and we'll talk about lipids and their structure and the role they play. Carbohydrates, you think of them as starch. The polymeric form of carbohydrates, which we call polysaccharides, are made by polymerizing smaller units, monomers, into a long polymer. The two most important polysaccharides are starch and cellulose. Starch can be classified as being either amylose or amylopectin. They're similar. Now, we usually think of starch as existing in plants, such as the potato here. But in animals, we also have a type of starch, we call it glycogen, which has a similar function, which we'll get back to in a second. Cellulose is another polysaccharide, which exists, of course, in plants and trees. It's the stem, the woody part, the cellular wall part. Now, both of these types of polymers, starch and cellulose, are made by linking together glucose as the repeating monosaccharide unit. And at the top of the slide, we show glucose in its ring form. And glucose has an ability to link together, to polymerize together. And we talked about this one time earlier. We talked about the two different ways that glucose can be linked together. One is by what is called an alpha 1,4 linkage, and the other is a beta 1,4 linkage. Just slightly different ways in which they are linked together. Now, the alpha 1,4 linkage is found in starch, amylose, amylopectin, and in glycogen, whereas the beta 1,4 linkage is found in cellulose. And as we explained earlier, the difference between potatoes and trees, the reason we can digest potatoes but not tree bark, is that we have an enzyme that will break down an alpha 1,4 linkage, but we do not have the enzyme that will break down a beta 1,4 linkage. That basically is the difference. Now, the function of starch, or glycogen in animals, is an energy storage molecule. And in fact, glucose can be either polymerized to form starch or glycogen or broken down back to glucose, and this is done all the time in our bodies. A function of our liver is to assist in the digestion of our food, and in doing so, we build up this storage molecule of glycogen from glucose units. Then later, the glycogen can be broken down in our liver to create glucose, which circulates through our bloodstream to our peripheral tissues, our muscles or brain, and we oftentimes refer to blood glucose. So glycogen is a storage molecule. Glucose is the mobile form of the monosaccharide unit that goes to all the other cells that need energy. Of course, cellulose plays a structural role in plants. We've said that a theme of biomolecules is that they are made from a relatively few number of building blocks. And in fact, starch and glycogen and cellulose are each made of repeating units of glucose. Now, there are other monosaccharides, but glucose is the dominant building block in forming starch and cellulose. Now, the next group of biomolecules I want to talk about are what are called lipids. And shown in this slide are two fatty acids. Now, fatty acids sometimes may get a bad rap, but in fact, certain fatty acids are actually essential to our diet. The top fatty acid is what is called an unsaturated fatty acid. It has that double bond that is sort of halfway down the chain, and this causes a kink in the structure of the molecule. And the bottom fatty acid is what is called a saturated fatty acid. You've probably heard of saturated fats and unsaturated fats, or maybe polyunsaturated fats. Well, this is the difference. And in fact, saturated fats are found mostly in animals, whereas unsaturated fats are found mostly in plants. And the carbon-carbon double bond, the point of unsaturation, causes the fatty acids to have a lower melting point, and that is why vegetable oils are liquids, whereas lard, which comes from animals, is a solid. Now, as a digression, I show the sodium salt of these fatty acids. This is what is called lye soap, which has been used by mankind as a convenient detergent throughout the ages. So these are fatty acids. Now notice that one side is what we call a polar side. It has charges and oxygens, whereas the long tails, the long alkyl tails, whether there is a double bond or not, are what we call the nonpolar parts. They don't like to interact with water, whereas the polar parts on the left do like to interact with water. Now, while these are fatty acids, more importantly, the fatty acids can combine, form bonds to something called glycerol, which is a 3-carbon unit, and to something called phosphate, which is shown in the tan, to form a kind of molecule called a phospholipid. And in fact, phospholipids are very common in our bodies, and as we'll see in the next slide, they're important in forming membranes. So, to review again, a phospholipid usually contains 2 fatty acids, whether they're saturated or unsaturated. We just show one of each just to show you the variety. And they are linked to glycerol, and then that is linked to a phosphate group. And the parts on the left are called the head group or the phosphate group. These are the more polar components. And the long alkyl chains, which are like hydrocarbons, like the high molecular weight components of petroleum, which we talked about at one time, paraffin and oils, the long alkyl chains are nonpolar. Now, a consequence of this is that if you have phospholipid molecules, and this is just another representation of the same molecule, but now it's pointing north to south, that these phospholipid molecules have a tendency to aggregate together in a way to avoid contact with water. So, for example, if you could have a number of these phospholipid molecules, their long alkyl chains or tails will crowd together, align together with their polar head groups or phosphate groups at the top of a layer, and in fact there will be a second layer pointing the other direction to bottom of a layer. And the result is something shown in the middle of the slide, where you have essentially 2 layers. One layer with the phospholipids pointing north to south and the other south to north, so that the polar head groups can interact with water molecules, whereas the alkyl chains, because they don't like to interact with water, they avoid contact with water by crowding together. Now, this forms spontaneously when phospholipids are added to water. And the key is that phospholipids then are the main component for forming membranes in our cells. This is what is called a bilayer membrane. Bilayer because there are 2 layers, a top and a bottom, like an ice cream sandwich where the polar groups are the chocolate and the nonpolar tails are the ice cream. And while we're showing only a small cutaway, this can extend to form a complete compartment that will become a cell membrane. Now, there are other kinds of molecules that we put in the category of lipids. One major group are what we call the steroids. Now, you've probably heard of steroids, and many of these are in the category which we call hormones. These would include estrogen and estradiol or testosterone. But steroids also include other hormones such as aldosterone and cortisol, which are involved in the regulation of metabolism and blood pressure. Steroids also are membrane forming, and the most important one is cholesterol, which is shown here. And you've probably heard of cholesterol and people worried about their cholesterol level, etc. Cholesterol can also align with phospholipids to form this bilayer membrane structure. Now, while we've talked about macromolecules, there are also a number of other molecules just to mention in this chapter. These include molecules which we think of as vitamins. Now, what happens is that vitamins will combine with proteins to form what are called coenzymes, that is sort of helper molecules that perform a variety of functions by bringing other kinds of chemistry. Some vitamins are what we call antioxidants. Vitamins can also be classified as either fat-soluble or water-soluble. Fat-soluble meaning they're like those fatty acids. They don't like to interact with water. And so fat-soluble vitamins will tend to partition into membranes, whereas water-soluble vitamins like water, and they're freely dissolved in the aqueous components of our cells and other body fluids. Now, this is a table that you've probably seen, which gives the recommended dietary allowances, the RDAs, for various vitamins. And this shows that if you're a male or a female, what the recommended daily allowances for the various vitamins will be. Now, I happened to look up another table which included a category for chocolates, and I noticed, I looked carefully and I saw that for males greater than 51, that it says you should have lots of chocolate. That's good. Okay, let me summarize by saying that what we've tried to show in these couple of lessons is that proteins and other biological macromolecules are made from a relatively few number of small building blocks, but that creates larger macromolecules that have various functions. Proteins are made from the 20 amino acids, and proteins are these microscopic machines that have various functions. Carbohydrates are either structural or energy storage molecules, and they are made primarily from the polymerization of glucose in various ways by linking glucose units together in different ways. Lipids are formed from fatty acids, with fatty acids being linked to some backbone unit called glycerol and then attaching other groups at the polar head group to create a variety of lipid molecules. Now, we have not talked about in this chapter DNA and RNA, but the same thing applies. DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, is made by the polymerization of 4 types of nucleotides, with these nucleotides differing only in what we call their base, which is either A, C, T, or G. So DNA is really made of only 4 kinds of components polymerized together to form these long molecules that store genetic information. RNA is similar, except it's usually single-stranded instead of double-stranded, but not always. And instead of having T, it substitutes a U in place of T. But otherwise, RNA is also made of 4 nucleotides. Now, we'll pause and have a quiz and go on then to our next lesson in biochemistry, in which we'll talk more about metabolism.